Okay, I hit record, even though Zoom just moved all the buttons on me, and that's yeah. I was just bragging to you about how much I'm on Zoom, and then I'm like, and then I can't find the record button. I'm talking to Victoria Tait. Victoria, to kick us off, tell us real quick where you are in your author journey. Maybe not real quick. Tell us where you are in your author journey as long as you want to.
Okay, so hi from Yorkshire in England, and I am a cozy mystery author, and I now write British cozy mysteries. I started off with a series in Kenya, well, based in Kenya after I'd lived there, and then I remember I think I spoke to you back in about May 2021 when you were just getting going, and we were talking about that, and then about a new series, and you really helped me get going with my new series, which is now 17 books long.
Dang, you
So,
move
well,
fast.
it's 11 with 11 in the main series with one more to go, and then it's six in a side series, and then I'm going to bring them back together and redo them as one single series going
Oh,
again because my character's about to get married and have children, and then they can't go sleuthing all the time because they've got to look after each other's kids. So
that's fantastic. Congratulations. That's
yeah.
super exciting.
After a conference we all went to recently, and someone was labeling where we were in our author career, and there seemed to be not very much between getting going and bestseller. I would definitely go in the which so I would definitely say I'm more in the lower mid list, if you know what I
Okay.
mean.
Gotcha. There. I mean, there is room for, I think, and actually probably more room than bestseller for like those of us who are like middling authors. We like
Yeah,
live in the middle, like
yeah,
bursts of sales, and then it gets quiet for a bit, and then yeah, not no John Grisham yet, but still cranking out the work. There
yeah.
used to be when I first started writing, there was a podcast called The Ditch Diggers, and I used to listen to it all the time. It was Mur Lafferty, I think her name was. Her name is. I don't think she's dead. And she was. It was an amazing podcast. But they were like, the two authors called themselves ditch diggers. They were like, we're not bestsellers, but we are like living in the ditches, digging constantly
Doing the
digging
work,
down. Yeah, doing the work.
doing the
Um,
work.
okay, so how can I help you today?
So as I say, I'm that series, the two series I'm bringing together, and I'm pretty happy where I'm going to go with. Well, I don't actually know, have a clue where I'm going to go, but I'll work that one out. But
Okay,
I want to start a new series, get a bit of freshness into my writing. And I know you've always said before, keep it simple, but I like to have lots of characters and lots of people doing lots of crazy things. So I'm considering writing a new cozy mystery series with three main characters. Whether they all have their own voice, and so vehicle characters, I don't know yet.
okay,
But they're all military wives, and they're at three stages. So you've got a younger, sort of 30-something wife who has just married into the military, left a high-powered job, one which I will make sure is useful to the sleuthing.
okay,
And she's lost her identity because suddenly she's just an appendage of her husband, and no one wants to know about her and what she does.
okay,
Then you've got a 50 something going sort of midlife crisis wife who's completely lost her identity to her husband and her children, and she doesn't know where she's going, so she's searching for identity. And then an older lady whose husband has retired, but again she's lived through the military, and I think her husband is going to be very ill or has died, so she then is like, well, what is my identity without the military? And
okay,
that's where I'm sort of going. So it's how to work with three main characters and how they can interact together, because they will have skills when they can work together, but I'm very conscious, having done the dialogue dash in the autumn, that there are different, they will be maybe anchors or what's the other one, what's the positive
engines.
one,
Yeah,
engines to each other, and how they interact, and how I can work with having um three main characters, even maybe if one is the lead character who are sort of searching for the same thing but at different stages. And sorry, we suddenly got sunlight in Yorkshire.
you're
This is really
totally fine.
exciting.
It doesn't bother me at all. You're great. It actually looked like suddenly you got like heavenly. It was
Yeah.
oh, yeah. So three characters, and before you start writing, you're trying to work out like how they interact with each other and what their
Yeah.
role is in each other.
Because when you've got one character, it's sort of simpler to say, right, there's one character going forward, and this is what what their want, their needs are, where they're going, and then these are the characters who influence them. But when you've got three, it becomes a little bit more complicated, and it's not a romance. It's it's a mystery. It's a cozy mystery. So they will bring different things to the part, different skills.
Yeah, and it sounds like
Oh,
the theme is kind of changing identity for all three of them. Would you say
yes, and
that's
I
true?
think yeah, it is. And having listened again to some of your podcasts, I think for me and for cozies, when you have sort of the change that goes through with a character in a book, I think that that actually is what I do over a much longer time in a series, say sort of 6 books or so, and
Yeah.
because we spread this out, and and otherwise I'd run out if I'm trying to write 18 books or something, and they have to, serious want or need every time. So it's yeah, what are they going for? But there's different stages, and it will go over the course of the series.
Yeah, I think of a lot of times in the type of fiction you're writing, like a cozy mystery that's going to be a long series. I think of the character change more like they think of it in like a television series. So like, you know, for example, like the classic TV show Friends, right? They had an episode every week. And that episode, they had to solve some kind of problem. And over a season, right? Like Chandler might be struggling with accepting himself over a season, like over multiple episodes in that series. And so I kind of think of the same, like you're talking about when we're writing genre fiction that like lines up like that. I do think character change goes over that season. At the same time, I think there needs to be a constant refreshing of the character change in every book. So like we need to see the struggle in every book. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I mean, I
Yeah.
think of it like you think Friends, I think sort of NCIS or
Yeah.
something, where
Same thing.
you've
Yeah.
got the episodic, and so in each episode they solve a crime, but
Hmm.
actually by the end of it we don't remember what the individual crimes are. We're just interested in where the characters are going and their interactions
Yeah.
over the whole
Yeah.
series.
The
And
will
over
the love interest, will they, won't they? Will
yeah,
she get over her like guardedness and past? And will he get over his, if I'm remembering NCIS characters from like
yeah,
the early seasons that I used to watch with my mom?
yes,
Will he you know, get over his like false bravado in order for them to actually like come together and be a couple, right? Like that was,
yeah.
if I'm remembering the two characters right. But that's the like, yeah, it's that like slow. Or they had the NCIS. There's always the lab, the like scientist in the lab for that
Yeah.
show.
Oh, he finally died. He was a British actor,
Oh,
and
did he really?
oh, he was incredible, Ducky. But I mean, and
Yeah.
they had a brilliant episode where they referred to his character. I can't remember exactly what it was, but when he was in a very early series when he got going,
Huh.
they actually had an Easter egg back to that original character, and
Oh,
it was
that's
like
funny.
oh, so clever. It
Yeah.
was good. Yeah.
But like him as an example, you're not going to see him change every episode.
No,
But
exactly.
you're gonna the first half of the season he's gonna have some kind of personal challenge, and somewhere in the season there'll be an episode that's really focused on that personal challenge, and then
Yeah.
in the latter half of the episode we'll see the like change in him. So so
So
the
could you have a hazard character? Because I love the ideas of these hazard characters, who these huge big characters, and they only show up occasionally. And so could you have them coming in and out, but then have an episode or a book which focuses on a particular issue that they have to overcome, and then you put them back into the background again, or they
Absolutely. I think that's necessary. Those characters call, and I think they're great. That kind of use of a hazard character is great for a long series like you're talking about, because your readers who are into the series will remember them coming back. Does that make sense? Like a reader who just picks up book 15 might not know, like, oh, this character was also in 3 and 7. But like, yeah, I think of it was only a 3 book series, but I read uh Lev Grossman, maybe The Magicians, and he does that. There'll be like random hazard characters that like show up at like the first of book 1, and then all of a sudden they're like back at the first of book 2, and it's a nice like, oh look, we're like bringing this character back, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and the thing you've got to remember is to get the character right, because the readers who read through all the series, they'll remember what that
Yeah,
character's like. And you suddenly give them a new car, and it's like, oh, whoops, oh yeah, they crashed their car, so they had to get a new one or
yeah,
something, because well, people remember them
they
when
will.
you
Well,
say.
like you're writing pretty fast. For me, like, at my best, I'm 3 books a year. And so if I'm writing book 4 and I'm bringing back a character a year later, I have to have all of that written down somewhere because there's no way I'm remembering all of those details. Um, so let's get into these 3 characters a little bit and we can work them out some. When we're talking about how they relate to each other, you know, in a cozy, you typically have a very positive feel. Um,
Yes.
so
Although saying that, I'm just going to caveat it, because I was thinking of writing women's fiction, and then I
mm,
looked at it and I learned a bit about it, and it's actually vast. And if you do mystery in women's fiction, it tends to be psychological.
it is, yeah, and that's heavier.
And that's much, much heavier and not what I'm doing. So it's, although it will be positive and there'll be lots of laughs and lots of banter, I still want to be able to bring in some more of serious points and serious edges, to the characters as well,
Okay.
in their growth. But yes, it has to be upbeat, but also, it's, and we've been discussing this, that almost because it is more upbeat, that actually when you bring in those serious issues, they stand out a little bit more than in a thriller where everything is dark.
Yeah, absolutely. And they totally will. I'm gonna pull up a whiteboard just for us to kind of talk through it together. So when we talk about the impact of an anchor or an engine, so an engine is the character that, like, this all relates to your vehicle character being the main character, the character that whose perspective you're in at the moment, right? So a an engine to your vehicle character encourages your character to be the best version of themselves and creates a positive feeling in the scene.
Mhm.
Usually, unless your vehicle rejects the engine and then you get that negative feeling. But in general, engines create a positive feeling because the character is encouraged to grow in a positive way. Anchors encourage the character to grow in a negative way. So they bring a little more heaviness, a little more darkness to scenes. Now, you get a big feeling of victory when your engine rejects an anchor. But if you have repeated scenes with an anchor, your vehicle is struggling to overcome in those scenes that anchor's influence, and it'll feel heavier. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So from what you're saying, it's going to be less anchor and more engine, because to keep it on the positive. I mean, you might have
Yeah.
someone who questions, and might irritate, but probably, but more than bringing someone down to be the, the worst version of themselves, as you say. It's That's not really where we're going to have much of.
Yeah. And so some combinations you have here, like to create that kind of cozy feel where home base, because often in a cozy, like, I mean, you know this better than I do, but often in a cozy, that the characters are returning to a home base, like the bakery or the library, or in this group, it would be like the military wives club, where their like center of life is. That home base is often an uplifting and grounding place where,
Yeah,
like,
it's going to be a cafe, I think, which
yeah,
is
they feel
with a
comfortable
nursery and a
there.
library. Yeah.
Yeah, it's where they process what's happening and where they like find encouragement from each other.
Yeah.
So um there's a couple ways to go. So if they're all engines to each other, you had mentioned in the email um me saying that I use a matrix. So this is
Yeah.
how I chart. This is the characters for the season I'm writing right now. That's really small. I'm sorry. Let me see if I can blow
That's
that up.
okay. No, go for it.
Tiny print. Let me make that bigger. There we go. That's better. So the series I'm writing right now has 3 vehicles. It has Mank and Jose and Chris.
Hmm.
And so I put my vehicles over here on the left. And actually, by the time I get to book 4, I wrote, this was the first series I published. I'm editing through it again. By the time I get to book 4, I actually have 8 vehicles total, but the books 1 and
And you
2 have.
told me to be simple.
I'm the worst. I don't follow my own advice ever. Yeah, don't read my work as an example of what to do. I don't ever do it. Um, Yeah, so I have three in the first two books that kind of change perspective. And then these are all of the characters in the first two books that like occur often. Right. So my three vehicles interact with each other. And then I've got Imani, who owns a coffee house that they all interact with. Bose is like my major reoccurring bad guy. There's monsters they fight. There's a guy named John, who's kind of lurking in the background that is kind of a mastermind that they all engage with. John has a group of kind of minions he calls the Lost Boys. There's a press room, and that's a chorus of characters. It's actually four characters, but I think of them all as like, this is the press room. There's a girlfriend named Maria, and then there's a kind of old retired dude named Chuck. So you can see, like, I do when I'm building out my character. Let me do this real quick so we can see it better.
And NA means that they don't have any
They
impact
don't
on you.
interact with them, or they are that character, right? Like, so Mencken is just Mencken. He's not going to
influence
there we
them.
go. That's what I need. I need a freezer row. Sorry. I always get confused as to like where where things are versus in sheets versus Excel. Yeah, it's so weird. So Mencken, right, like NA, he doesn't impact himself, right? Like he is himself.
Himself, yes.
Yeah. But
Right.
Jose is an engine to Mencken. And you know, I've talked on before, and we taught in the most I don't think we taught it in the autumn dash. We're going to do it in the dash coming up this fall. But we taught it in the spring dash. Engines that pull versus engines that push. So engines that pull are characters that you want your lead character to represent in some way. It's modeling behavior. So Jose is very optimistic. Mencken's very cynical. Part of Mencken's change arc over the series is to become more optimistic. He's never going to match Jose's optimism, but I want him to grow into that thing of Jose. So he's an engine. Jose is an engine that pulls. The way I do my chart is I always assume a pull as opposed to a push. So you'll notice I mark it when it's a push. Um, Engines that push are engines that the character grows when he's around them, kind of because they challenge the character or uh because the character actively wants to be better for them. So the character isn't modeling behavior necessarily. The character is growing because of the presence of this other character. So another example of that might be, well, so Chris is one of my characters. Jose is an engine. Oh, I marked this wrong. Jose is an engine that pushes for Chris. Chris doesn't ever want to model Jose. Chris feels responsible for Jose. So when Chris is around Jose, he grows into the best version of himself because he feels responsible to care for Jose. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So we have the modeling in an engine.
You have to step up,
Yeah,
basically.
you got to step up when you're around that character, right? So you have the modeling in the engine that pulls, and then the challenge to be better in the engine that pushes. That's important. And the reason I'm laying this out for you is because when we get into talking about your three characters' personality traits, we'll talk about how modeling can happen, but how they can also push each other and that to be better. And so that allows you in a cozy where you have all this positive feeling, allows you to let these characters still have diversity in how they're growing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yes.
Yeah. So Chris is one of my vehicles. You'll notice Chris and Mencken are anchors to each other. They don't their attributes line up. They're both very cynical and they're both a little arrogant. Those are the qualities they both need to grow out of. When they get around each other, they pull each other toward those qualities, toward that cynicism, isolation, and arrogance. Right. So they're anchors that pull against each other. So they'll like when I'm writing a scene with the two of them in there, I recognize that like, okay, this is going to be a tough scene because they pull each other down. So I have scenes with all three of my vehicles together, like you're going to have,
Yeah.
and they're interesting. Now, this is a thriller. And so those scenes feel heavy because Mencken and Chris are anchors to each other. Jose and Chris are engines. Mencken and Jose is engines. So what I end up getting, whenever I put these three characters in a scene, is I get a scene where Jose is playing peacemaker between two characters that are frustrated with one another. So you got two characters who are making each other into the worst version of themselves. It naturally leads to conflict when we're acting out of the worst version of ourselves, or just behavior that we don't want replicated, that the reader doesn't want replicated. And then I get Jose as a peacemaker trying to pull the group back to the best version of itself. Now that's a dynamic I wanted. I wanted that because Jose's a kid. I wanted Jose in that position of calling everybody, calling these dark characters in a thriller to the best version of themselves. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. So then I have Amani, who's a character that just shows up. In the first book, she's probably in 5 scenes. She's an encourager to everybody. She's very community focused. These are all kind of isolated characters who need to learn to grow into community. So she encourages community. The bad guy, Bose, Mencken only sees him once. So he's a hazard for Mencken. There's not enough
That's with H.
interaction.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the hazard characters are characters that are big personalities that cause a challenge. So Menken's terrified by Bose and the monsters, but he doesn't see them enough to be like, oh, this is an ongoing relationship with these characters. So they're just hazards. They show up and he has to respond. Um, Sometimes they drive him into isolation. At the end of the book, he sees them and they drive him into community. So it's that like he can go either way when he sees them. They're anchors for Bose is an anchor for Jose and Chris. He drives them both to be the worst version of themselves. He's an anchor that pulls because he is kind of dark and uncompassionate. So they match his level of aggressiveness, like kind of like a classic villain who's like, I break all the rules to get my way. They tempt the heroes into being like, I will also break the rules to get my
So
way.
when you're talking about the push and the pull for that one, they're sort of getting pulled. An anchor who is like that is pulling the vehicle character down to sort of their level, and they
Yep.
almost like mimic some of their behavior.
They'll start mimicking their behavior. Yeah. So it like, taking this out of the like action realm with this is in, if we were going to go with your three characters and we were saying like, let's create an anchor, all three of these characters are searching for identity. If you had a character that you know pushed was isolated, let's call her isolated Izzy, who like rejected community and was like, you need to be an independent woman who doesn't have anything to do with community, like not painting Izzy in a bad light necessarily, but let's say she's like a commanding woman of business who's like, you know the key to finding your strength is to understanding that you are the best version of yourself when you're pushing yourself all the time, right? That's
Yeah.
probably an identity you don't want your three characters seeking out, that like aggressive ambition. If they're around Izzy and they all feel drawn to that aggressive ambition, that's an anchor to all three of them that tempts them to behave in ways that are negative growth for them.
But I could see maybe the young wife who's come out of ambition, that she's pulled towards that because that is something that she is used to. So she might get pulled down where the others
Yeah.
might be. So you could have it for one character when not necessarily for other
Yeah,
characters.
so she might be, Izzy might be a anchor for the young wife, but then end up being, and this is kind of how it diversifies. That might be an engine for the older wife who's like, I want to retire, I don't want to do anything, and isolated or ambitious Izzy's going to pull the older wife into ambition. Does that make
And
sense?
so
Like it's
this is
that.
how you can, yeah, how they will start to interact differently. Yeah.
Yeah, and so what's fun with when you're using the same characters over a long series is you can start to create for each book, you can bring in those other characters, whether in a cozy mystery, whether it's like the client that's hiring them to solve something, or the witnesses that they're interacting with, like that cast of characters around that specific mystery. Those cast members can play differently with each of the characters, right?
Yeah.
A cozy that does this really well, that is has kind of a three to four vehicle prong, is the old TV show Psych.
Oh
Um,
yes.
is a cozy mystery,
Yeah.
comedy mystery. And you have Sean and you have Gus and you have oh, I can't remember the female police officer's name, but she's kind of a main vehicle too. And then you got kind of a side vehicle in the other police officer. But really it's Sean and Gus show.
Yeah.
And different characters enter in each week and they affect Sean and Gus differently, right?
Yes.
But Sean and Gus are engines to each other. Like they cause each other to grow in the right direction. So Gus calls Sean to responsibility. Sean calls Gus to freedom and adventure, right? Like, so they call each other to the best versions of themselves. Um, and that's that. But then you enter in a character that's like super adventurous. Sean might love that character, whereas that's too much for Gus, right? Like
Yeah.
that's too hard.
He
So
pulled back.
yeah, so you get that, like the character might be an engine for one and an anchor for another, which is what a chart, like we were talking about, like remembering things over a long period of time. That's where a chart like this starts to come in
Yeah.
handy. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now
Yeah.
I've shorthanded. If I was really going to build this out huge, I'd probably put my characters' personalities in here, like the three. I use three words to describe each character's personality. It reminds me of how they need to grow and like what they need to change. I know these. I've been working on this series for 10 years. I know these books so well. I don't need to put their personalities in here, but that's something. If you're starting a new series, I would, in that kind of chart, I would probably list under here, like, I'd put Mencken, and then I'd underneath I'd write like cynical, um isolated, um and he's really mission obsessed.
So this is like when we had the booklet and the dialogue dash, and we had the
Yeah, you got the
personalities
three
there.
personalities, like we said, like, hey, dial it down to three personalities, because beyond, your character can be super complex and have like depth and emotion, but when you shorthand your memory of that character, you're really going to remember like three, maybe four things. So like dial it into three, maybe four. um Whereas like for Jose, I have like um optimistic, self-doubting, and playful, right? Like those are my three words for him. And then for Chris, I've got cynical, uh isolated, and and damaged. So I might do this kind of thing if I when I'm listing characters for a newer series, so that I can shorthand, like, okay, and then I can look at like, why are these two anchors to each other? Why are Mencken and Chris
Yeah.
anchors to one another? Oh, well, because they're both cynical and isolated. So like, that's, why is Jose an engine to Mencken? Well, because he's optimistic. And Mencken, and why is Mencken an engine to Jose? Well, because Mencken's got that mission obsessed, and Jose's super self-doubting. Does that make sense? Like,
It does, absolutely. So is Chris an anchor to both of them?
no, Chris is an engine to Jose, because he is also, I didn't put it in here because it's not a major, but he is also mission obsessed. So
Okay.
there's like a seriousness to the adults that Jose needs to learn, that he kind of needs to grow into.
Oh, of course, because Jose, yeah, he's
Yeah,
a
because he's a kid. Yeah, so that's, but are you starting to feel how that like kind of works?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I like it sort of that when they've got similar, and how those can interact to either pull or push them up, or down, so that they sort of start to, as I say, as we said, mimic really.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Model
because
that,
that's
mimic or model that behavior.
quite easy to remember. And then I think when building out the personalities, I think that's also it's to remember and to think a little bit how those words work for each of those characters, so that there is some overlap as well between them.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, yeah, absolutely. Um, okay. how can we move forward to help you? Do you want to talk personalities? Do you want to talk different ways they can engage each other? What's going to be most helpful?
I don't know really because I'm not I'm not that
You're
well
not far enough
developed yet.
along.
I've been
Yeah.
sort of trying to get other books written. So whatever you think might be best, I think, because you're often
Let's
very good
just
at.
brainstorm some combinations for you where you've got like some kind of trope, because all of these casts come into like trope combinations. It's like, oh, here's things we've seen before that
Yeah,
work, right? Like,
yeah.
so some ways that these, if, and assuming they're all engines to each other, right? They
Okay.
all want to help each other grow. So what you want to do to make them all engines to each other is to start looking for some specific personality traits as you're like planning and thinking about how this character works, that like, oh, if she has this, the others have this. Does that make sense? So
Yeah, so
if
like
we,
you were saying, someone was optimistic. So if one of them was optimistic, which is what you were saying.
yeah. So like if we play into their age, um,
Yep.
kind of a, you know, consistent I'm sorry, if we play into their role as a wife, not personal age, but like how long they've been a wife, how long they've been in this life. This is a common trait, right? Where you've got uh
Hmm.
and then so the young one's going to be self-doubting, the old one's going to be resilient, and the middle aged wife might be kind of present. I can't think of the word for it, but like present experience, like relative experience. Does that make sense?
I think
So
so. Or in the
they
middle. Yeah.
all, yeah, they all three have something that they can learn from one another and grow into. The self-doubting wife needs to learn that, like, that's the word I'm looking for, is uh satisfied, right? Kind of living in a place of satisfaction, of like,
Right.
this is who I am in my like relationship as a military wife, right? So you've got the self-doubting one is going to learn from the satisfied and resilient one. Whereas the satisfied one is actually going to learn to question herself a little bit when she needs to, maybe not be so overconfident from the self-doubting one. And the resilient one might grow in a different way, but definitely is serving as an engine to these two. Does that make sense?
So what you've got is you've taken a trope, a personality, and
Mhm.
you split it. So we're looking at a person really through the three different lenses or through a prism. That was what I was thinking when I
Yeah.
was doing this, was that in a way you've got almost one person, but as you turn the prism round, you will see them through a different lens, and that's a different way that they are, but they all interrelate.
Yep. So, like the young wife, when I'm writing in her perspective, I'm going to write a self doubting voice. And this is, again, all hypothetical, right? I'm going
Yeah.
to write a self doubting voice, a voice that's like insecure in her role as a military wife. When I'm writing the middle aged wife, I'm going to write in a like secure, satisfied, kind of stable voice. When I write in the older wife, there's going to be more wisdom to it. There's going to be more kind of resilience, and kind of like, I've seen it all, right?
I've done
Like,
that before.
yeah, I've done it
Yeah.
all before. So there's almost a, instead of resilient, we could call this like, for this example, a like uh a humble wisdom, right? For
Okay.
her. And like they're specifically around their role as a wife. And this is like one aspect. So that's how I'm going to write each of them. But then when I'm writing in the self-doubting wife's voice, and she's expressing her doubts as a wife, like worrying as a wife about next steps, that's the middle-aged wife when she speaks is going to have a certain impact on the self-doubting wife, and the older wife is going to have a different impact on the self-doubting wife. But if I'm in the middle-aged wife's kind of satisfied confident, where she is, if we called that confident too, um if I'm in her like satisfied confident phase, and I'm writing from her perspective, and the young wife starts self-doubting, that can actually be an encouragement to move the middle-aged wife more toward humble.
Right.
Does that make
Yeah.
sense? Right?
Yeah, it
Like
does.
to move the
Bit more
middle-aged wife
push.
more toward here. Yeah.
Mm.
So that's one way, that like one personality trait can build them. And what I'm doing is I'm looking for something I want one of the characters to grow out of. And then I'm asking, okay, how do the other characters serve as engines to each other to
So they're
pull
sort of
that
growing along
character?
a spectrum
Yeah,
and
a
then
hundred
moving
percent.
along. So you're starting with the sort of the lowest, the doubting, and you're moving them up the spectrum because they're pulling each other up that
Each other up
spectrum.
that spectrum. Yeah. So, and another way we might do this is like this would be their role in life. But what if we're talking about like their worldview? What personality trait could we use to define their worldview? And there's no like right or wrong way to do this. I'm literally just picking weird things out of the air to be like, what defines a character? So like their
Mm.
worldview, um, this may be where you want the older wife to grow. And we might say like the worldview of the older wife is one
She
of
needs independence, I guess. She hasn't got independence, so maybe she needs to have
gotcha. Yeah. So like longing for, or we could call her, yeah,
dependent.
but
I
that,
don't know.
what'd you say?
Dependent is what I said.
Yeah, dependent. Yeah. And let's say that she like, mournful. She doesn't
Mhm.
like that state that she's in, right?
Yeah.
Like, so there's a mournful dependence in her life where she like regrets this. So we might make the young wife um
The other
optimistic.
end of the scale.
Yeah.
The other end of that sort of spectrum. So they move down, they're moving, she's sort of pulling the other two more towards her.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be that way, right? Like we can make her optimistic, right?
Almost
Like we
quite I
can,
quite like that because I can I can
yeah,
get that. The
it keeps it
process.
easy. Yeah, it keeps it clean. Yeah, it keeps it clean. But so the young wife might be optimistic, and maybe the middle wife is realistic,
Yeah.
right? Like so now you've got this like the young wife is going to be an engine to the older wife because she's calling her that optimism. The middle-aged wife is going to be an engine to the older wife because she's calling her to that, you know, realistic view of the world, right? Like so they're both calling her in a way to that specific thing. But you can see already we've just done two. We're building very different characters here.
Yeah.
Does that make
Yes.
sense?
Yeah.
And at the same time, the middle wife is going to call the young wife to realism when that optimism gets too far to gauge, and the young wife is going to call the middle wife to optimism when her
When she,
realism becomes pushes towards cynicism, right? Because with all of these traits, you have the like pros and cons of them.
mm-hmm.
So like self-doubting, it can be crippling. In rare occasions, self-doubt can actually also be empowering,
Yeah.
right? Because you don't take anything for granted. Confidence can be empowering. Confidence can also be like crippling. So you can use these traits to say, like, okay, they're different. And then you, as the author, are actually making the choice as to whether that's an engine relationship or an anchor relationship. Because in the same way that the wife's realism can be an engine relationship to the young wife, where the young wife is called out of over optimism to realism. This could also be an anchor trait if you want it to be.
Right. Okay.
So whether characters are engines and anchors is a decision you're making as to like how do you want the story to feel and how do you want the cast to feel with each other. Because you're writing a cozy, we're gonna go, okay, all of these are engines to one another.
And then
Does
you're
that make
probably going
sense?
to have your anchor is probably going to be somebody sort of cynical in a position of responsibility who sort of pulls them all down and who they all try and have to
Yeah. So
team
typically
together
these,
to sort of
yeah, the classic kind of cozy is the like police detective,
yes,
right? Grumpy police detective.
grumpy.
That's the that's the kind of classic cozy, here's the anchor to all three of them.
Yeah.
And so, if you've got these like personality traits already building and you want a different kind of take on the grumpy police detective, you might make him cynical, right?
Mhm.
That contrasts with the optimism and realism of how do you spell cynical? We're gonna check. You might make him mean. That contrast, since I can't spell cynical today, you might make him mean, which contrasts with the like, satisfied, self-doubting, humble. He's just mean, right? Like
Mm.
you might make him judgmental. And what I'm doing is I'm just looking for personality traits that are different than these three, that are going to have a
Mhm.
negative impact on these three, right? The mean, and we can call him critical, the mean critical side of this character, is really going to harp into that self-doubt of that young wife. It's really going to harp into the mournful dependence of the older wife, right? It's going to take that realism of the middle-aged wife to a negative place. The
And
like,
then if you made them a sort of made the grumpy detective a lone wolf, then you're going to have they're sort of going to have the team, and he's going to
yeah.
be sort of
And he doesn't have to be like a comic book character. You can also say, like, okay, maybe he's not judgmental. Maybe we go mean and critical. And then maybe our third personality trait for him is competent.
yeah,
Maybe
yes,
he's really good at his job,
yeah,
right? And that also will play as an anchor into all three of these, because he's
mhm,
actually knows his identity and is really good at his identity and is critical. So you have a character that they're searching for identity. He knows who he is and is very critical of
right,
them. It
yeah,
puts them always off ease. Does that make sense?
yeah, it does definitely.
Yeah. So if he gets them, and what's nice about what you're doing, like another trope of these three characters is, you get him in one-on-one with any of these characters, they're gonna crumple
Mm,
you, because he's going to overpower them as an anchor. You get all three of them together in a scene with four of them. Now you've got three engines working against a single anchor, and they're going to overpower him together.
and
Does
then
that make
hence
sense?
why they can solve the mystery which he's been struggling with or whatever, and how they can,
Yeah.
because that's always how do three amateurs manage to solve a crime which a police detective can't do, because because we all do that.
Yeah. And so often in cozies, that's about like competence, like
Yeah,
competence versus perspective, right? Like, why is Sean in Psych able to solve all the mysteries that the police can't? Well, he just sees the world differently.
yeah,
So he sees things differently than they do. Why is Gus able to like get people to say things that the police usually don't? Gus just talks differently to people, right? Like, it's part of his it's part of his buttoned up personality. He becomes something the police can't do, even though the police officers are very confident. Does that make sense?
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Jules.
yeah.
Jules is the name of the female cop. Sorry, it took me forever. It's
Okay.
been like rattling in the back of my brain while we were talking. Um, but you can, and she fits. They fit that mold. The three of them, Jules, Sean, and Gus, fit that three engine mold of
Right.
where they are. Lassiter kind of plays this role.
Yeah, I was going to say, is
Yeah,
Lassiter more like that? Yeah.
he is. And again, the thing about a
So,
long series, as these characters change, their relationships to one another change.
yeah.
So in Psych, Lassiter starts off being kind of an anchor to everybody, but as the series grows, he becomes an engine to everybody, right? Because Lassiter changes as the series goes on, and as he changes, he becomes actually like an empowering figure to the rest of them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
but
Um,
grown.
yeah. So is this helpful? Kind of laying this out like
Yeah, no,
this?
yeah, this is great, and it's good to see how it works. In my mind, I can sort of see how this starts to fit together, and that you can have an idea for a character, but by picking the three personality traits, you can sort of direct how it's going to work. Yeah, so you can organize it up front, I
Yeah,
guess.
you can organize it up front. And again, I'm big into discovery writing as well. So I try to get like, okay, I have an idea of how this is going to work. And then I'll usually try to write a couple scenes, lay out those scenes and be like, okay, how did that, how does that feel? Does this feel right? And I'll find after like three or four scenes, I tend to adjust these some, mostly because the characters become solidified in my mind. So I say that to
Yeah,
say, like, make your plan and then hold it loosely. Does that
yeah.
make sense? Like, build your plan, and then, and the key is go back and redocument what you did.
Yeah, that's the bit where I guess I struggle, because then I just get writing, and then I don't necessarily come back, and I'm thinking, and I'll read
Yeah.
my notes and think, no, no, that character definitely isn't like that because I
Uh,
changed them.
yeah. Yeah, I'm the worst at that. I don't document. I say this to people that I don't document anything, and I come back and I'm like, wait, what did I do? What's happening? Um, yeah, yeah. It's
but
especially with
I think that,
names.
like all
Oh,
these things, it's good to start. It's good to start with a plan. So it's good to start with a plot, even if you change who's murderer is halfway through.
Yeah, absolutely. It's good to have an idea, and then it's also good to let yourself discover new things as you go.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Yeah. So,
Oh, I do. Yeah, I'm like that. I've gone from being definitely been starting out with sheets of paper and the beats and cutting it into quarters and how it all worked and post-it notes
mhm.
and plotting to now I will do an outline. I will say how it is. Here's the suspects, and this is who I think the murderer is. And then, as you say, then discovery, right?
Yeah, and what's nice about this kind of so a prolonged series like you're thinking of writing, what's nice about it is that each book you're going to get a cast of hazard characters
Or the
that,
suspect,
yeah, the suspects that can change how each book feels.
right? Yeah,
Right. So maybe in your first book, you have one suspect that's like suspicious, and then they all have to kind of deal with a suspicious character. You have one suspect that's like overly confident, and then you have another suspect who is angry. Right. So now we've got kind of three hard personality traits. And the question is like, how does this character interact with a confident?
mm,
They probably rub each other the wrong way, right? When they come around.
yes,
How does this character interact here? They probably don't like each other very much, right? Like
yeah.
this is a cast where your three engines are going to hate all of these characters. But then in your next cast, like in your next book, you can change these out and have one of your suspects being kind of super compassionate, right?
Yeah.
One of your cast um being also like dependent and mournful, and then another one of your suspects being anxious. And you can see that like the anxious and the self-doubting character are probably going to pull each other in a negative way, but the older wife's going to want to take care of that anxious character. So
Yeah.
the anxious character is going to be an engine that pulls. The middle-aged wife might want to take care of that anxious character, or she might be annoyed by that anxious character, right? Like it's your call as to how you make that happen. And
It's
it's
a
your
big.
like as that vehicle, you're making the decision for your reader. Hey, this is the emotional journey we're going on. But like
So
these two
although they
characters
have
are,
they
oh yeah.
although they have these character traits, there is no hard and fast rule about how they interact with them because it's all again it's on another sort of spectrum whether they go one way or the other
Yeah.
towards it.
And that's the beauty of like seeing your cast members as tools and creating an emotional feel for your book is that you write a super compassionate character, and then you put them in a scene with all three vehicles and you go, okay, how does the young wife feel about this character? How does the middle-aged wife feel about this character? How does the older wife feel about this character? And not just how do they feel, but how do they respond in who they are when this character is around, right? Because it's a twofold question. The young wife may love the super passionate character, and but the super passionate character is a negative influence on her because it bleeds to her like over optimism. Does that make sense? The
Yeah,
bleeding
yeah,
heart and the over optimism go together. The realistic middle-aged wife might come around the super compassionate character and be really annoyed by her
yeah,
because she's like, what are you doing? Or might be inspired by her,
yeah.
right? Like, but that's your choice as to how this middle-aged wife is going to respond to this character. The key is in a story, you don't want to play with that response without character growth. So if you decide I'm annoyed by the middle-aged wife is annoyed by the super passionate, compassionate character,
Passionate. Yeah,
you don't want to change that unless the middle-aged wife grows.
right. Okay.
Right? You want to change the how the middle-aged wife sees this character when the middle-aged wife grows. You don't just want to change it randomly. Like you don't want the super compassionate character showing up once, the middle-aged wife being like, I'm okay with him today. And then the next time they show up being like, I'm really annoyed with him today. Because what you're doing is you're showing change in the middle-aged wife to your reader without without any justification for that change. And it makes our characters feel uneasy and like very gaseous, like we can't quite get a hold of who they are. And so, because we understand our characters and how they relate to the other characters. So, when your middle aged wife is annoyed by the super compassionate character, you want that annoyance to continue until the middle aged wife has had some kind of growth moment where that growth allows them to see this character differently.
And so that's why you say about the hazard characters are those characters who come in and out, and they show the growth
Mhm.
because they show the reaction of the vehicle characters to them shows that reaction.
Exactly. It demonstrates how the vehicle character changes because
Yeah,
the hazard character is static.
yeah,
So if we think about this as like a scientific equation, the hazard character is your non-variable,
yeah, yes,
whereas the vehicle characters are your variables, right? Like they're varying based on there's it like the reaction is the change the character's gone through over time, right? Like the stimulant. So what we're doing is we have the variable, we apply a stimulant, the things that have happened over time that have potentially changed that variable, and then we have the non-variable or the static character that's coming in that we're weighing our variable against. Does that make sense?
it does. And I was trying to think back to, thinking back to sort of CSI, and you had Ducky who no NCIS. Ducky didn't really change very much during the whole thing.
Yeah.
He had his mother to sort out, and he had this, that, and the other, but he was very similar to it. But then the other characters, even well, I don't know, because I don't know if maybe they were all vehicle characters, but they all had sort of different changes and different storylines. So you still have storylines, I guess, with your
Mhm.
hazards if they come in through the book, but they probably don't change that much.
Yeah, and so there's different types of vehicles. Like Ducky would probably be what we call a supporting vehicle, where he's
Uh,
not going to get the same amount of scenes as the other vehicles. He has his own storyline, he has his own change arc, but it's very small
yes.
because he's not. So the change may be like, is he anxious about his mom, or
Yeah.
is he dealing? How's he dealing with his worry of his mother? Is he dealing with it in a positive or a negative way? Right, like a
Yeah.
supporting vehicle who's kind of a side vehicle that we only see every once in a while. This your if you write enough of these, your police detective will probably become a side vehicle. He'll start to kind of have his own plot line happening. We'll see it in the background. He may never have a scene in his point of view, but he is undergoing some change. Maybe you learn that like part of the reason he's mean and critical is because he has a dad that's mean and critical. And then on like book 15, you have a book about him and his dad
Yeah.
where we see his interaction with his dad soften. So then in book 16, he comes back and he's just critical. He's not mean, right?
So if I'm really organized, I could plot out all my books, but
And
we'll
I
see.
would I wouldn't though. I would try not to do that because you want to discover where these characters go as you write.
But try and remember, because you're right, but it is nice to remember some of the things about them and what changes them, and then to write that into a book, which I hadn't necessarily thought of.
Yeah, and that's what makes series great is that ongoing, like you were saying at the beginning of our conversation, it's not necessarily the mystery that's solved that they remember, but the progress of the side plot that went on, right? Like so, and that's what we mean here is that like it's that change that the character's going through that creates the emotional journey for the reader that is what they actually connect to. The mystery is just kind of the stimulus or the path that the character's walking while the character's learning who they are. So you
Yes,
have a series of mysteries you're going to line up. With each mystery, you bring in a different cast of
hazard.
personalities
Yeah,
and those personalities all now that step on the path looks different for your three engines. And the question is in that book, how do your engines develop when confronted by these personalities? Some of them may not develop at all, right? These three personalities may have no effect on the older wife. She is who she is, regardless of who they are. But these three personalities might have a big effect on the younger wife.
yeah.
And so that step on that path is a big deal for the younger wife, but not a big deal for the older or middle-aged wife. Does that make sense?
It does. I suppose what I need to try and work out, because I do like to have my, as I say, my large casts, and then I like to have the people who, yeah, the various characters, and I bring in all sorts of different characters because I'll bring them in for one book and then they'll stay and they'll like, be you know, a barista in the coffee shop or
Yeah.
the auctioneer, and so they then come in and out, and then they start to have their own little bits of story going on, but they
Mhm.
don't have a huge impact on it. So it's like, is that hazard for, is it a vehicle, or is it an engine or an anchor? And it's just trying to work out who some of those subsidiary characters are, where they fit
Yeah.
into.
And I found a lot of times in a long series like you're writing, you're right, a character will come in as a hazard character. Like you'll start writing a book and you'll have this like anxious character, and they are
Yeah.
just a suspect in the murder. Who
Hmm.
knows why? But then as you're writing, you're like, man, I really like writing this voice. And this
Yeah.
voice is very, so let's say we're like on book 3, we've got this anxious character. You're like, I really like writing anxious Amy. She's fun to write, and like something about her personality just clicks. In book 4, you may move her over here, and now she's just an engine that's kind of living in the community that your characters can respond to. Does that make sense? Or maybe she's a more complicated character so that she's a engine to the older wife, but an anchor to the middle. So now these two characters have a ongoing character on the side that when they see, they're pulled in different directions. She's pulled down and she's pulled up. Does that make sense?
It
And now
does. So just
it creates conflict between these two, right?
yeah.
Like,
So naturally, as you go on and you develop more characters, it will grow, and this will get more complex.
it does, yeah, because and that's how life is. Like the longer
Yeah.
we live with people, the more complex our relationships get, and that the reader like I'm under the opinion. I know I as a reader, the readers in my life, they like that kind of ongoing complexity, right?
Yeah.
Like when
Yeah.
my wife is a big reader of the Outlander series, she loves the Outlander series. When she tells me about the books, she doesn't necessarily tell me. Like she'll tell me weird events. Like she thought it was really funny at one point. Jamie wrestles a crocodile in one of the later books. She's like, this was weird. So she'll tell me like those events, but a lot of times she's telling me about conversations between the characters, moments between the characters, and the complexity of that relationship. Right. Like so, in that relationship, we have our main um vehicle. Her main two vehicles are Jamie and, man, I can only remember that he calls her Sassenach. I can't remember her name because I'm terrible with names. But we have our lead female character, and then they have a broad cast around them who are
Yeah.
never vehicles, but that broadcast around them impacts them in very different ways, right? Like
Hmm.
in the early books, you have the uh uh Captain Jack, the like, kind of
Yeah.
evil English officer, and he's an anchor to both of them
Mm.
early on. But then by the time you get to the books where they're like in France, he actually starts his presence, he becomes an engine that pushes to Jamie.
Is that because Jamie has changed then?
It's because
I haven't
Jamie has
got that far.
changed, because Jamie goes through this big traumatic experience in the first book, redefines himself in some ways, loses some of his like youthful ambition, and is more grounded. So when he becomes more grounded, he relates to that character differently and starts seeing that character as a child. And there comes a point in those books where that character can't really do anything worse than he's done. And Jamie has now overcome that anchor. So in
Mhm.
later books, when Jamie comes around that anchor, it's an anchor he's overcome and reminds him of the best version of himself. So now that anchor is actually operating as an engine
Yeah, and
for
pushing
Jamie.
him.
Yeah, pushing him forward. So there's that, like over these long series, just to say, like, what's beautiful about a dynamic cast that you're talking about is that how they relate to each other starts to change and grow as they go. And I think a lot of times the mistakes we make is we try to hold all of that in our head,
Yeah, yes.
and it can be really dangerous. So I just recommend you write it down somewhere.
I'm trying to. I've got a character who started as probably as a hazard, who then became the main character in my side series, and then I'm trying to wrap that one up. And you're right. I'm trying to. At the moment, they're all having, all the characters are having to reassess their situations, and I've thrown lots of bad things at them so that we can get some resolution at the end of where all these characters are going to go. But I'll suddenly look back at something and I think, I haven't brought that character in, so I need to, for my readers, I need to wrap up and tie up all these threads, and you're right, readers really like the threads tied up, and
They
you've
like
got
the
to
threads
try
tied
it.
up. Yeah. And this is different than like the logical threads tied up of like, hey,
Yes,
you told me that anxious Amy was in the middle of a divorce. Did that ever happen?
yeah,
This is different than that. This is like, how do the characters relating to each other? How is that progressing and evolving? That's the thread through your books that you want to keep linear. So
yeah,
like how if suddenly your middle-aged wife loves anxious Amy, when in the
hmm.
last book she hated anxious Amy, your reader's going to want to know what happened.
Why? Yeah,
Why? What changed about the middle-aged wife that now she can love anxious Amy? That's the
yeah.
thread that like has to stay linear through the books.
And I suppose that's, I mean, I think, with people talking about police procedurals and going, oh, but books aren't realistic because it would take this long to do this and this long to do that. And of course, when we're writing our books, we actually tend to have quite short time frames, because
Mhm.
otherwise you would have all these changes which you couldn't hold together. So you have to almost have something happen in a week to a month, because
Yeah.
otherwise life takes on, and then there would be the impact, and you'd be like that, and where's that character gone, or how has the change been made?
Yeah, and I think part of what we love about reading fiction, this is a theory that I don't have any evidence for, but I when I listen to read, besides anecdotal evidence, when I listen to readers talk about books, part of what we love about books is that change in real life is messy and unclear and is often wrought with
Stressful.
failure and like is hard. Changing
Yeah.
our personality is hard. Like I've had a big battle with personal self-doubt and like understanding my identity in the world over the last 20 years. It's tough. If you're writing a novel about my life, I'm gonna solve that problem by the end of the novel. And that's part of what we love about fiction. Is part of the fantasy of fiction isn't just the fantasy of the world, that it allows us to live in a world where change is possible and
Mm,
like things, people can grow and clean and ideal. It's part of what makes fiction inspirational for us, is that like we read A Man Called Ove. Now in or Uve, however you say his name, we read A Man Called Uve, and in real life, Uve probably remains grumpy, isolated, and mean, has sparks of community, but really does live out his days in a more tragic way. But
mm.
in the book, Uve is going over to dinner at the next door neighbors every
Yeah.
week, right? And that's
And then get to know the
inspirational.
kids and all of
Yeah,
that.
and they
Yeah.
get to know the kids,
Yes.
and they get to like, and that's inspirational. That's what we want life to be. So that's part
Yeah.
of like what I think makes fiction beautiful and why we love it, is it's not just, oh, we go on a cozy mystery adventure to solve a mystery that we may not get to solve. I'm a baker, but I don't solve mysteries. Isn't it fun to be a baker that solves mysteries? It's more about like, I'm a young wife who's struggling with self-doubt, and I connect to this other young wife who's struggling with self-doubt. Even though I'm not in the military, I'm not solving mysteries. That's where I connect. And seeing her grow inspires me that growth might also be possible in me. If that if that's a little weirdly
So it's a
philosophical,
little
but let's
bit
have
like,
fun.
and I think I heard someone say that their book isn't complete until their reader has read it, because we can write our words and our books from our point of view, but the reader will always read from their experience and their point of view, and so they will then complete that sort of that feeling in that book, and for each reader it will therefore be different.
Totally true. And when we're thinking, yeah, I've never heard that before, but I really like it. And when we're thinking in like character growth arcs and like, why are we going to all this trouble to plan character growth? We are offering a kind of message of hope when we're writing a book of positive character growth. And it's no fun to share messages in empty rooms. We want to
Yeah.
see the impact of that message. We want to see that message change people. So the reader in that, kind of brings a beautiful satisfaction to our effort. And that
Mm, yeah.
when readers connect with our characters, what they're actually saying is, hey, I found myself in the growth arc of this character. I found myself in her struggles and in her like dealing with those struggles.
And
right? Like,
that's why some readers they will then say this has really impacted on my life, even if they've been reading, as you say, like a cozy mystery or something, because they
yeah,
found something in a someone's character which has really resonated
hmm
with them and has helped
yeah.
them to deal with it something
And in
in their life.
Cozy, some other tropes that we didn't talk about are like, the shy character who is reluctant to adventure, and then the character that's super adventurous that drags them out, right? Like, or you have the character that's meticulous and analytical, and then the very messy character, right? Like, those are other combinations that, like, they encourage each other by their like accentuated traits. They pull each other toward a more common neutral, right? Like,
So you've got a pairs of characters, pairs of character traits.
yeah, and that's another thing you can do with a group of three like this is these two, like the young wife and the middle-aged wife, may relate in a way that the older wife and the middle-aged wife don't. But the
Yeah.
older wife and the middle-aged wife might have their own growth arcs where they're encouraging each other in other ways that doesn't relate to the younger wife. And so part of what's nice about a larger cast is you get to kind of play with those dynamics.
I think that's why I want to do it. I've gone for I got bored with all my characters and I didn't really we got over a sort of a series arc of 6 books and then I was like, what do I do next? So I sent her on holiday. And that's when I started a new character. But when I brought her back, I couldn't bring her into the same world. So then she was on her own and she was isolated and having to
Mhm.
make friends, but she was quite shy. I found it really hard to write. It's much more energetic, I think, when you can have the larger scenes and the banter and the characters playing and reacting off each other
Yeah.
and in my books drinking lots of tea and eating cake or scones.
Yeah. And the problem with like writing a single vehicle book where your character is shy and isolated, or like shy and reflective, like shy and thoughtful, is that's a very thoughtful, reflective book, right? Like, you almost immediately, I've read so many scenes where people are like, okay, I've got this shy and reflective character. I don't know what to do. And I'm like, oh, you have to give them a buddy who's like energetic and outgoing just to bring some energy to this thing. Because
Yes.
otherwise, we're just watching her be in her head the whole time, right? Like, we need the like charismatic, charming, maybe charming to a fault friend who's like, my mom
Yes.
used to watch a TV show called Remington Steele when I was growing up. It's a
Called
little older
what?
than Remington Steele. When I was
Oh,
growing up,
right.
it's a little older. And the idea is that like there's a woman who's a really great detective, private investigator, but she can't get any respect because she's female. So she hires this guy to be like the face. It's Pierce Brosnan. She hires him to be the face
Oh,
of the
God.
of the thing. And he's very charming, but also a little dumb. And so like, but if you're watching a show with just her, she's not charming and not fun, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
so we need him to like
Yeah.
make her relatable and engaging. And his like being relatable, partnering them together, his being relatable and engaging allows us to see her in a different light because we start to see all the strengths she has that he's missing, right? Like, so it's that you see both characters differently when you put them together. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think certainly in Cozy, I think there has been, the Richard Osman books, but also, Death in Paradise, where
Yeah,
you've got sort of two or three or more characters, main characters working together because of that, and it is easier and to have them reacting off each other and to get
absolutely.
a bit more banter.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Um, well, thanks for doing this with me, Victoria. This was great.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I didn't do very much at all. You did it all, but I knew you would do because you're great at that.
I just like chatting, so it's a lot of fun. I'm gonna hit stop and we can talk a little bit more.
Thank you.